The bridge officer gripped the railing as the destroyer pitched 40 degrees, steel groaning like it would snap. It was December 1944, somewhere in the Philippine Sea, and the American Third Fleet was fighting an enemy that had no flag, no strategy, and no mercy. Typhoon Cobra had turned the ocean into a vertical maze of water walls. 3 destroyers would sink within hours. Over 700 men would drown without a single enemy shell fired. And Fleet Admiral William Halsey would face a court of inquiry, not for losing a battle, but for underestimating the sea. This was not the first time the ocean had decided a naval war, and it would not be the last. This is the story of why admirals on both sides of World War II feared weather more than torpedoes. It is about the storms that scattered invasion fleets, the fog that saved battleships, the swells that made aircraft carriers useless, and the ice that turned convoys into coffins. It is about 6 naval battles where tactics, firepower, and courage mattered less than wind speed, wave height, and the temperature of the water. And it is about the hard lesson every navy learned too late. You can outgun an enemy, but you cannot outgun the ocean. Here's what the textbooks don't tell you. Behind every naval battle, there was a question admirals asked before, "Where is the enemy?" It was, "Can we even fight in this weather?" German U-boat logs, American carrier reports, Japanese staff notes, all of them mentioned the same fear, because during World War II, the ocean killed more ships than some entire enemy campaigns. The United States Navy lost more vessels to weather-related causes than to Japanese submarines in certain Pacific sectors. Typhoons, hurricanes, and Arctic storms accounted for dozens of ships and thousands of men. The ocean didn't care who had more guns, better training, or air superiority. It simply was. And if you were in the wrong place at the wrong time, it would kill you. One of the most striking examples occurred in June 1944, just days after D-Day. The English Channel, already treacherous in calm conditions, was hit by the worst storm in decades. The Allied invasion had succeeded in establishing a beachhead, but the logistical lifeline depended on artificial harbors called mulberries and a constant stream of supply ships crossing the channel. The storm, later referred to as the Great Storm, raged for 3 days. Winds exceeded 50 miles per hour. Waves reached heights that made unloading impossible. Over 800 vessels were damaged or driven ashore. One of the 2 mulberry harbors was destroyed completely. The American mulberry at Omaha Beach was abandoned. Thousands of tons of supplies were lost, and the Allied advance inland, which had been gaining momentum, slowed dramatically because fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements could not get across. German commanders, watching from their defensive positions, were equally frustrated. They could not counterattack effectively because their own supply lines were disrupted by the same storm. Coastal artillery could not fire accurately in the wind. Reconnaissance aircraft were grounded. The storm had imposed a kind of tactical stalemate that neither side could break. Post-war analysis would later show that the 3-day delay in Allied logistics may have extended the Normandy campaign by weeks. The ocean, not German resistance, had imposed that delay. But the real shock was not just the material damage, it was the realization among Allied planners that weather forecasting, despite all the advances in meteorology, was still inadequate. The Great Storm had not been predicted with enough accuracy to prevent the disaster. Ships were caught at sea. Harbor construction crews were working when the storm hit. There were no evacuation orders because the weather models had underestimated the intensity. The lesson was clear. Even with air superiority, naval superiority, and industrial superiority, the Allies could be stopped by something as simple as a low-pressure system moving faster than expected. Let's talk about the Pacific. The geography of that theater made weather even more dangerous. Typhoons in the western Pacific were more powerful and more frequent than Atlantic storms. They could form quickly, intensify rapidly, and cover thousands of square miles. And unlike the relatively predictable hurricane season in the Atlantic, Pacific typhoons could occur almost year-round. The Imperial Japanese Navy had centuries of experience navigating these waters, but even they were not immune. In October 1944, Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet was supporting operations in the Philippines when weather reports indicated a typhoon forming to the east. Halsey's staff debated whether to alter course. The decision was made to continue the mission. The fleet sailed directly into the storm's path. The result was chaos. Destroyers, which had low freeboard and were top-heavy with radar and weapons, were particularly vulnerable. 3 of them capsized. Dozens of other ships reported severe damage. Aircraft were torn from carrier decks and thrown into the sea. More than 100 planes were lost, not in combat but to wind and waves. And the 790 men who died that day drowned in their own ships, trapped below decks as the vessels rolled over. Survivors described hearing metal scream as the hull twisted, watertight doors that wouldn't seal, sailors clawing at ladders as the ship rolled past 90 degrees. One destroyer went down so fast, the radio operator never finished the distress call. The ocean gave no time for heroics. It just took. Halsey would later call it the worst experience of his naval career. A court of inquiry would criticize his decision to continue operations despite the weather warnings, but the broader point was undeniable. Even the most experienced admiral in the Pacific had underestimated the ocean. The Japanese had their own version of this disaster just a few months later. In June 1945, as American forces prepared for the invasion of Japan, a typhoon struck the fleet anchorage at Okinawa. The storm damaged or sank dozens of ships, delayed the offensive, and forced a reassessment of invasion timelines. Japanese commanders, observing from the home islands, were briefly hopeful that the weather might do what their diminished navy could not: stop the American advance. But the storm was indiscriminate. It hit both sides. And it reminded everyone involved that the ocean did not care about strategy, morale, or industrial capacity. Now let's go back to the Atlantic. The Arctic convoys to the Soviet Union were among the most brutal naval operations of the war. These convoys, designated PQ and QP, sailed through some of the most hostile waters on the planet. The route ran north of Norway, close to German-occupied bases, through seas where winter temperatures could drop to 40 degrees below zero. Ice would form on the superstructures of ships, making them top-heavy and unstable. Waves could reach 50 feet. Visibility was often zero due to fog and blowing snow, and the convoys had to maintain formation, keep radio silence, and watch for U-boats and German surface raiders at the same time. Arctic convoy veterans had a saying: "The Germans can only kill you once. The cold tries every night." Ice would form on superstructures faster than crews could chip it away. Men froze to death standing watch. One convoy reported a sailor fell overboard in the Barents Sea. Within 3 minutes, hypothermia would make swimming impossible. He was never seen again. The ocean didn't sink ships with torpedoes, it made them top-heavy with ice until they capsized. Ships were lost to ice pressure, to capsizing in heavy seas, and to men simply freezing to death on deck before they could be relieved. What happened next in the 90 seconds after a ship began to list was always the same. Crews scrambled to chip ice from the high side. Pumps ran at full capacity trying to compensate for the weight imbalance. Officers calculated whether to turn into the wind or away from it, knowing either choice could be fatal. And all the while, the convoy had to keep moving, because stopping meant becoming an easy target for U-boats lurking beneath the ice. One convoy, PQ-17, was ordered to scatter in July 1942 after intelligence suggested a German surface attack was imminent. The scattering made the individual merchant ships easy targets for U-boats and aircraft, but it also exposed them to the full force of Arctic weather without the protection of a convoy formation. 24 of the 35 ships were lost, some to enemy action, some to the sea. The lesson the Allies learned from PQ-17 was not just about tactical coordination, it was about the necessity of weather intelligence. After that disaster, the Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy invested heavily in meteorological reconnaissance. Aircraft were sent out ahead of convoys to scout for storms, weather stations were established on remote islands, forecasting models were improved, and convoy schedules were adjusted to avoid the worst of the winter storms. The investment paid off. Later convoys had significantly lower weather-related losses, but the cost of learning that lesson had been high. Let's shift to the Mediterranean. The weather there was less extreme than the North Atlantic or the Pacific, but it was unpredictable. The region is prone to sudden storms called medicanes, short for Mediterranean hurricanes. These are rare, but when they occur, they can be as dangerous as tropical cyclones. In addition, the Mediterranean has strong local winds like the Mistral and the Sirocco, which can change sea conditions rapidly. Naval operations in the Mediterranean during World War II had to account for these variables. Amphibious landings, in particular, were vulnerable. The invasion of Sicily in July 1943 was nearly postponed due to high winds and rough seas. Landing craft were swamped. Equipment was lost. Troops were seasick before they even reached the beach. But the invasion went ahead because the strategic window was narrow. The cost was higher casualties and slower progress inland than planned. The pattern repeated at every beachhead. Men struggled to exit the boats in waist-deep water while waves pushed them back toward the ramps. Equipment sank, vehicles stalled. Officers shouted orders that were drowned out by the wind and the surf. And all of this was happening before a single enemy shot was fired. The ocean, in those moments, was a more immediate threat than the German and Italian defenders on the shore. The planners had known the weather forecast. They had known the risks. But they had gambled that the invasion could succeed despite the conditions, and it did. but it succeeded at a higher cost than it would have in calm seas. Now consider the role of fog. Fog is one of the least dramatic weather phenomena, but in naval warfare, it can be decisive. It hides ships from each other, it grounds aircraft, it makes navigation dangerous, and it levels the playing field between technologically superior and inferior forces. The German battleship Bismarck, on its fateful voyage in May 1941, used fog and poor visibility to evade British patrols for over 30 hours after sinking the HMS Hood. The Royal Navy had air superiority, numerical superiority, and better radar. But in the fog and cloud cover of the North Atlantic, Bismarck was invisible. It was only when the weather cleared and a reconnaissance aircraft spotted the ship that the British were able to close in. The weather had given Bismarck a reprieve, and when the weather changed, that reprieve ended. Similarly, during the Battle of the Atlantic, U-boats used fog and poor visibility to approach convoys undetected. Allied escorts relied on radar and sonar, but both systems had limitations in certain weather conditions. Fog could scatter radar returns. Heavy seas could mask sonar contacts. The result was that U-boat commanders sometimes had more tactical flexibility in bad weather than in good. Convoy commanders knew this. They knew that every fog bank, every rainstorm, every patch of low visibility was an opportunity for the enemy. And they knew that their own technology, as advanced as it was, could not fully compensate. But the story didn't end in the Atlantic. It extended to every theater. In the Pacific, the Battle of Midway, in June 1942, was influenced by weather in ways that are often overlooked. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft were delayed by cloud cover and poor visibility. They missed the American carriers until it was too late. American dive bombers, by contrast, found gaps in the clouds at exactly the right moment to attack the Japanese carriers. Was this luck? Partly. But it was also a function of weather patterns that neither side fully controlled. The outcome of the battle, which changed the course of the Pacific War, was shaped not just by tactics and courage, but by the position of cloud banks and the timing of visibility windows. Let's return to Typhoon Cobra. The court of inquiry that followed the disaster in December 1944 was harsh. Halsey was criticized for ignoring weather warnings, for failing to adjust course, for prioritizing the mission over the safety of his fleet. But the inquiry also revealed systemic problems. Weather forecasting in the Pacific was inadequate. Communication between ships was poor. Commanders did not have real-time access to meteorological data. The Navy responded by creating a dedicated weather service, by improving communication protocols, and by training commanders to take weather threats as seriously as enemy threats. But those reforms came too late for the men who died in Typhoon Cobra. The psychological impact of weather on naval forces is difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Sailors who survived major storms often described them as more terrifying than combat. In combat, there was an enemy you could see, a threat you could react to. In a storm, there was nothing but chaos. Ships rolled unpredictably. Men were thrown across compartments, water poured in through hatches and vents, and there was no way to fight back. You could only endure. Post-war interviews with veterans from all navies consistently mentioned storms as among their worst memories. The ocean, they said, was indifferent to courage, training, and technology. It simply was. And if you were in the wrong place at the wrong time, it would kill you. Today, naval forces around the world have access to satellite weather data, computer models, and real-time tracking of storms. Modern ships are built to withstand conditions that would have sunk World War II vessels. But even now, weather remains a critical factor in naval operations. Hurricanes still force fleets to evacuate harbors. Ice still limits operations in polar regions. Fog still grounds aircraft. The technology has improved, but the fundamental challenge has not changed. The ocean is still more powerful than any navy. The story of why admirals feared weather more than torpedoes is not just a historical curiosity. It is a reminder that warfare is not just about weapons and tactics. It is about the environment in which those weapons are used. The ocean was not a neutral platform. It was an active force that shaped decisions, determined outcomes, and killed thousands of men who never saw an enemy. The admirals who understood this survived. The ones who did not paid the price. If you want to explore more about how environmental factors shaped World War II, check the description for additional context. And if this story gave you a new perspective on naval warfare, consider subscribing. History is full of battles decided not by the strongest side, but by the side that understood the battlefield.